if you want to start, Eileen. So good afternoon, everyone. It's almost 12 o'clock, so I'll just say good afternoon. So this is the second session of the panel that's on gender, urban space and security. My name is Sohaila Nazneen. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. And with me, the co-convener of this session is Marioke Ostrom. She's also based at IDS. So in this session, we have 3 presenters, and we will be continuing on the same theme that we covered in the morning, which is around women's voice, around sexual harassment when they experience it, organizing around resisting harassment if that happens, what kind of strategies do women use, and sort of these are urban settings that we are looking at, urban workplaces, so basically looking at gender-specific vulnerabilities and the role of social norms and culture that is there. So what will happen is I will ask the presenters to pitch their summary points about their presentations. Hope you all had a chance to look at the recordings and the papers that have been uploaded. And after that, we have certain questions for the presenters, and then we'll open up the floor. You feel free to type in questions in the chat box, or if you want to raise your hand, that's also fine. So let me just quickly introduce the panel. First, we have Joy Lin. We had the pleasure of having her as an MA Gender and Development student last year. She's based in Shanghai. Then we have Belen Martinez, who is based at University of Sussex doing a PhD. And lastly, we have Arunima Kishore Das, who's joining us from Australia. She's also going to be talking about her research, and she's based at University of Western Sydney. So Joy, up to you to give us your 2-minute pitch on your main findings and whatever you want to highlight from your paper.
Thank you very much, Sohaila. Hello, everyone. I'm Joy Lin. I graduated from MA Gender and Development program in IDS last year. I'm also a feminist advocate in China. I founded an initiative focusing on awareness raising in 2016. So this research is my graduate dissertation. It is analyzing 2 archives and conducting autoethnographical analysis with a feminist theoretical framework He Yin Zhen established more than 100 years ago in China. This was out of my own confusion when I participated in Me Too movements in China with our collective of individual stories and interviews of sexual harassment, including 19 victim survivors stories and 2 harasser stories. And the confusions are, why are Me Too movements imported to China in higher education sector and evolved or spread mainly to public good and media, when in my interviews, it's not like limited in these areas. And also, why does it appear to be a movement about sexual harassment when many cases are not, especially in my own interviews? And also, why is it so hard to push for promotion for our collectives with our ordinary people's stories? So through my analysis, I found that Confucian moral outlook, especially the self-sustaining social hierarchies, including the gender hierarchies, highly influenced the movements, as well as Chinese characteristics. I reckon that I asked a very big question that I'm not able to answer comprehensively. Therefore, I'm interested in studying it more. And the theoretical framework is not very much developed. It was born in 100 years ago, and it was not sufficiently used. So I'm also very interested to explore more on this, on developing this theoretical framework. And that's all of me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. That's perfect. If you look at Joy's paper, it touches on sort of how she brings different bodies of literature together to answer her queries about what's happening in terms of looking at sexual harassment in higher education, but also how women themselves mobilize and sort of think about what's the impact of that. Okay, we'll move on to Belen. Belen, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. This presentation is based on my PhD research, where I examine the different opportunities that working as taxi and platform-based drivers offers to women. My ethnographic research took place in Malaga, a city in southern Spain, where I interviewed taxi, Uber, and Cabify female drivers. In my presentation, I analyzed some of the female drivers' challenges and experiences of fear and harassment, and how they produce a space from which women are excluded. Participants felt that certain parts of the city and certain times of the day are not safe enough for them to do their work. Consequently, only a minority of participants admitted working nights and weekends, which are the busiest and most profitable times in the sector. This, together with other challenges reported by participants, show that the ride to the city becomes a powerful tool showing which social groups can occupy the public space. I have also pointed out some of the strategies participants deployed to feel safer. Often these responses are silence and self-censorship of the potential danger, but in some extreme reactions, some participants challenge gender stereotypes by non-conforming to the cultural norms of traditional femininity. Additionally, female drivers play a dual role in the dynamics of violence as the receiver of sexual harassment from clients and colleagues, and simultaneously as the protector of other women, mainly clients. Therefore, I highlight the importance of recognizing that female workers provide unique value to the male-dominated transport sector. Still, it also shows that women perform a kind of labor that goes unpaid and unnoticed, contributing to capitalist value extraction and accumulation.
Thanks, Belen. That's perfect. We'll move on to Arunima. So Arunima, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Arunima, and the paper that I have presented is basically a part of my PhD research. And in my PhD research, as I explained in the previous session, I wanted to look at the diverse dimensions of women's experiences of sexual harassment on public transport in Dhaka city. So specifically in this paper, I focused on 2 autonomous social media interventions by Bangladeshi women to address sexual harassment happening on public transport. The first intervention that I looked at is Nari Mohila Bus Service. This is a women-only Facebook group that was established to collect money from its members to launch some women-only bus services across Dhaka city to protect women from sexual harassment. Although this initiative failed in its primary goal to launch women-only bus services, it actually offered women a comparatively safer platform to openly share their sexual harassment narrative, an opportunity that is not available to many women in the specific patriarchal, legal, social, cultural context in Bangladesh. So this initiative, Nari Mohila Bus Service, actually offered women a chance to create a form of solidarity based on their shared anger and frustration against sexual harassment and led to a feminist consciousness. The other initiative that I looked into is the Ga Gheshe Daraben Na campaign. That is a young women's attempt to create collective awareness on sexual harassment by designing some t-shirts and hairpins that contain the tagline Ga Gheshe Daraben Na, which can be translated as "Don't stand so close." So both these initiatives had the opportunity to create some form of solidarities among women, but they are not beyond question because both these initiatives were basically dominated by a selected group of middle class Muslim young women. And the other thing is, these women did not have any experience of grassroots level political organizing. So the social bonds they created that could not transcend beyond the online spaces. So the solidarities that were created is basically a weaker form of solidarity that cannot properly address the issue of sexual harassment of women on public transport. So in short, this is like some highlights of my paper. Thank you. And I'll very much welcome any questions that you might have about this paper during our discussion.
Thank you, Arunima. So you can see that all of the papers, there is the aspect of online as a public space. It's also about women working or women in education. There's, of course, the dynamics of the kind of work and the class of women you're talking about, which kind of women that takes public transport in Bangladesh, or is it about taxi drivers? What kind of class backgrounds are they coming from? Or if it's about women in higher education in China, well, you know, which background are they coming from? There are issues around intersectionality there, but also issues about how do you formulate collectively to strategize to gain protection, and what's the potential of that. So let me start with questions to the presenters, and then we'll open up the floor after we have heard their responses. So Joy, in the paper, you detail out sort of the online action that was being taken by women who were experiencing harassment in Chinese higher education at the different universities. Did it translate into action in other spaces apart from online? I mean, you touch on that in the paper and all that, but our audience would like to know a bit more. And also, could you sort of discuss the intersectional dimension of the activists? So they are in higher education. They may be from a particular type of background, or there may be other intersectional aspects involved in. So can you reflect a bit more on that?
Thank you for your question. So the online action in Me Too movements in China did translate into offline spaces, like feminist activists engaging with university students to advocate for better anti-sexual harassment procedures or lawsuits, especially those, I don't know what's it called, milestone lawsuits against the offenders, and other offline demonstrations. But of course, due to the political situation, it was easier, less risky, or cost less to engage online. And I think it's quite important to acknowledge that the movements are still going on. There are few but continuous cases exposed online and getting public attention and discussion and getting some level of justices. I'm talking about both institutional, judicial, and also personal justices. It is because people who are suffering from sexual violence are encouraged by the victim survivors who voiced out during the year Chinese Me Too was loud. It's 2018. People, especially the general public, are getting more awareness of the issue, the sexual violence issues, through the discussions online. And regarding intersectionality, this is also another issue that I wanted to criticize the movements on in my paper. In particular, the hegemonic narratives promoted in the Me Too movements in China is old male intellectuals with more social resources sexually violating young college-educated women with less social resources. All the other narratives not fitting in were unheard or unspoken of. In the archives that I studied, there are very few social media and mass media coverage about the factory female workers, anti-sexual harassment movement, or there was this McDonald's service workers anti-sexual harassment, anti-sexual violence movement, and other like cleaning service workers movements. So if you have watched my presentation video or read my dissertation, you know that I utilized a Chinese feminist framework. It's the main one of the very important point He Yinzhen raised was that the ultimate goal of feminist struggles is equality for all, meaning regardless of class, race, region, etc., and gender, all people should be treated equally. Therefore, we can see that through the lens of He Yinzhen's feminist framework, the Me Too movements in China did not really consider the class inequality and other inequalities in its strategies and agendas. And that's also one of the limitations of the Me Too movements in China. I hope I answered the question.
Thanks, Joy. I think class has been an issue in the Me Too movement elsewhere also, and sort of the debates in the West, because you talk about the cleaners and others. It's been the same in the West also, that the cases that we know about are about the Hollywood actors facing discrimination, but there's discrimination in other sectors, and what gets silenced and what gets picked up is quite an important aspect, and class is always an underlying variable in a lot of other settings, and we may be picking other dimensions of intersectionality and not necessarily class, which is an important aspect to pay attention to. So clinging on to the question of class, let me move to Belen, because Belen, you're looking at a particular group of workers who are in kind of a precarious employment. It is sort of, you're being self-employed, or you have you're an entrepreneur if you're working for Uber, right? Uber didn't take responsibility for a lot of other things. So what happens when you face harassment at your workplace, when you're self-employed, or when you're in this kind of precarious sector? And you talked about women coming up with informal strategies, which is similar to what we heard in the first panel around domestic workers and all that. But apart from trying to protect each other kind of strategies, what are the possibilities for collectivizing? And you also touch in your paper that policymakers are not really paying attention, right? So what do we see in terms of potential of collectively organizing, and what can we do, or what can the workers do, or where can they raise demands?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this question. I found it very interesting that actually you asked me this, because that was one of my first questions when I arrived at my fieldwork in Malaga. I was desperate looking for associations or some kind of group of women from this sector, either of these sectors, and I couldn't find any. And I was a bit surprised, and it would have made my life a lot easier because then that meant that it was quite challenging to find these women. But also, yeah, I was just surprised that they were not like mobilizing in a more formal way and demanding some changes or some improvement in their working conditions. And so to reflect a bit about this, I would like to separate the two groups I work with. So the first one was the platform-based drivers. So in my case, it was Uber and Cabify. So in Spain, it works a bit different as in other countries, because in Spain, actually, most of these workers are employed. So there is like a third company that works between Uber and employs these drivers. So they are actually employees. So they are subjected to the normal law regulation in Spain. But for example, something that I found is that they don't have a specific organization that represents them. They are represented by the main trade unions at the state level in Spain, which are very traditional. And sometimes I wonder if they really take on board these new ways of working. And then looking into that, I didn't see any specific claims for women within these trade union organizations, neither a subsection, for example, specific for women. And what made me think what the reason might be for that is that, first of all, the gig economy is relatively new in Spain. So Uber landed in Spain in 2011, but actually it became quite popular in 2015 when it started having more passengers and therefore more people working for them. So it's relatively new. And also something that I've noticed with COVID is that it's a very precarious and unstable kind of sector. And actually all the women that I interviewed that were from this gig economy sector, only one of them was still working for them. Every other women used to work before COVID, lost their jobs because of COVID, because they didn't have passengers and they lost their jobs. So I think that shows how precarious and stable this sector is, particularly for women, and why probably they wouldn't like to engage much further in any political commitment. And then the other group, which is the taxi drivers, is a different kind of group. They are usually self-employed. Most of the women I interview are owners of the car and the license. They are usually inherited them or bought them from their fathers or husbands. There is an organization that represents taxi drivers. There is one local in Malaga that is very strong. But to be part of that organization and to be able to participate and decide things, you have to be a taxi owner. So if you are employed by another taxi owner, which is quite common, you wouldn't be represented on those organizations. So they are quite specific. And then when I was talking to my participants about this, because I was really curious why they were not, they had so many challenges and why they were not like making their voices a bit more heard and trying to fight more for their improvement in the working conditions. All of them told me they were not interested in any political engagement whatsoever. And actually I have one of the quotes that is quite telling from one of the participants that said, "I'm not interested in politics. I like to help, but I don't want the responsibility. I prefer to be at the back." And I think, and that was quite general among participants. And I think that shows that they don't want the responsibility, but also they don't want the visibility that would provide. And to me, I can understand that, because when I was doing my field work and I was interviewing these female drivers, I was usually at the places where they work, and there were other drivers, which were mainly male drivers. And when they realized I was only talking to the women, they would get very upset. They did not understand why I was only talking to the women. They would make jokes. They would get very defensive. So then I imagine, as a woman, if you start this adventure of creating more formal organizations, I imagine that would bring a lot of, you will have to explain a lot of that to your colleagues, and it would probably bring some visibility that they don't want. So the only organization that I found is quite informal, is a women taxi drivers organization. They meet once a year. They don't do anything in between. Every year they meet in a different place of Spain. It's at a national level. And as one of my participants told me, we talk about taxi sector, tell anecdotes, this and that. So basically, they don't take this opportunity as a way of discussing issues and putting an agenda on how to improve that, but it's more a space to share and spend some time away from their families, which also one of my participants told me, and just share anecdotes. So it's not really, there is not a political goal there. So I think in general, my view on why there are no more like formal active actions, collective actions, is because women don't want to be seen as different or demanding from their colleagues. Importantly, men don't seem to acknowledge that women can have different experiences, challenges, and demands. And I think that goes back to something that we were talking about discussing on the first session, which I find very interesting. That is not only women, no, who need to be pushed to have her voice heard, but also like, what else do they have around them that would facilitate that? And I think it also follows a bit the gender stereotype that politics is a man's world. And I find that particularly ironic, because these women, my participants, are working in a male-dominated environment. They are challenging gender stereotypes, but they don't want to go farther than that. They seem to be, they prefer to work, to keep their work safe, and not get too much attention, so they can just keep working. So I found that quite interesting. I hope that helped.
Yes, thanks, Belen, for going into detail about the type and the degrees of informality in the sector, and then what does it mean in terms of organizing, but this thing about not wanting to make waves if you have entered a male-dominated sector and sort of saying, I don't want to be visible, or it's a responsible. It's quite interesting that politics is defined as a responsibility. I don't necessarily think men would think or define politics about that. I know I'm like overly generalizing, but it's also quite interesting that harassment is political inherently, because you're talking about power structures. So how can you not go there if you really want to address? But we also need to think about there's a cost that comes in terms of collective organizing and raising your voice. So not everyone may want to bear that cost, or unless you have the support structures, you may not want to venture and join. So it's that perennial problem of collective action that we study in the literature, but we are seeing it for ourselves. Arunima, I will hold my question to you because there's been a question in the chat by Prosperous to you. I'm sure you have seen it. So it's about basically when women do share their anger and frustration in Facebook, because you are talking about online platforms that women are organizing in terms of harassment in public transport, do they get support from the law? Your paper touched on what happens and the kind of backlash that they face. Do you want to elaborate on that? And while others are listening to your answer, please type your question in the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself after Arunima answers and offer or reflections, feel free.
Okay, so the question is whether they get support from law. So basically, in my research, what I have found is women actually turn to social media because they don't get adequate support from the law, the support from the mainstream media, or the support from the police, you know. So, and this is another big issue with this type of social media intervention. So, just chatting or just sharing and liking some certain aspects of sexual harassment and gender issues, to what extent it can bring a long-term change. That is a big problem. So let me just go back a little to properly explain the answer. So firstly, in the patriarchal legal social setting in Bangladesh, there is this idea of ideal womanhood. So you'll have to like behave, talk like an ideal woman, a respectable woman. And to do that, and because of that, the issue of sexual harassment or anything to do with sexuality is thought to be a taboo issue. So women are discouraged to not talk about sexual harassment publicly. And from the media, like the mainstream media, do not even cover incidents like sexual harassment on public transport unless they take the format of rape or even like homicide. So in such a situation, and even for my research, I also tried to investigate NGO-led or government-led violence prevention initiatives that address sexual harassment. And I have found that very few projects actually focus on sexual harassment of women on public transport. So in such a situation where women do not get support from like media, do not get support from NGO or government, and even there is no specific law in the country that addresses sexual harassment of women on public transport. And many of the women I interviewed, they have explained to me, like, if they go to police with a complaint for sexual harassment on public buses, they will be further stigmatized or being laughed at. So of course they do not go to police. So they don't necessarily have any support whatsoever, whether or not they support it, they share their sexual harassment incidents in Facebook. So yes, this is the problem. They don't get support anywhere. They can come and because they don't get the support, then they actually go to social media to at least rant about sexual harassment. But again, the question lies here is whether or not this ranting of sexual harassment can bring long-term changes.
Thanks, Arunima. I think it's been running across all the presentations in terms of the lack of support from formal structures, particularly law and order. I mean, Joy, you touched on that there were legal cases, against harassment, but it's also about how many cases got resolved. And then there are the processes that we heard in kind of the first, with the first panel that was raised in the Ugandan presentation, that when you do go to court, and what are the procedures like? And then what does that procedure do in terms of you even being able to present your case? But also in sort of the case studies from the Bangladesh in the previous panel, that this is not something that people think about, that will go to whether when it happens, and you sort of seek informal ways of addressing it. And one of the informal ways is to rant about it online. But even when you rant about it online, you also get quite a backlash in terms of comments, which Arunima's paper touches upon. So Arunima, there's another question in the chat box from Claire Hawk, which she's asking if you can talk about security issues for women on Facebook. So which is, I just touched upon backlash, but would you go into details about what you have found?
Yeah, so I can see actually two questions for me. First one is from Marwoke. I don't know if I pronounced your name right. I'm very sorry if I didn't do that. But I'd like to answer that first, because that actually relates to Claire's question as well. So the thing is, this is why Nari Mohila Bus Service has a specific role to play, because this is a women-only Facebook group. So the Facebook group is only for a chosen few group of women. And most of these women actually know each other. And so because this is a women-only group, these women feel like they are more comfortable to share their narratives of sexual harassment in that online space without the fear of further stigmatization. And the security issues, and so this is the other thing. Online platforms, of course, we do know that, of course, there are misogynist people everywhere, and like women using social media even to participate in #MeToo campaign have always experienced negative stigmas and stereotypes and attacks. And this is something that I have discussed in terms of the Gha Gheshe Daraben Na campaign, because that was not that was an open access platform to share those t-shirts and hairpins with that tagline. So this woman, founder of the Gha Gheshe Daraben Na campaign, she actually experienced rape threats, death threats, and so on. But on the contrary, because Nari Mohila Bus Service was a women-only platform, so many women actually took that platform as their first space to first starting to talk about sexual harassment. And so I'm saying, like, even though their initiative did not completely succeed in launching women-only bus services as they planned, but it's not something that you can really overlook. Because in the cultural setting of Bangladesh, you don't get any support from anywhere, and you are even discouraged. Like, many of the women were not even informed about this term of sexual harassment, or even the literal Bengali translation of sexual harassment. And even when I explained to them, they would try to replace the term, because it is a taboo term that has the word sex or sexuality in it, you know. So they would be using terms like man misbehaving, man doing bad things to women. So in such a situation, these types of online spaces, although there is security issues and things like that, but still it gives a comparatively safer platform for women to challenge the hegemonic dominant narrative of sexual harassment as a taboo, or sexual harassment of women on public transport as a taboo or trivial issue. So it's at least one step, like taking the first step towards collectively challenging sexual harassment, or creating a collective awareness on sexual harassment, even though not fully possible to address sexual harassment properly. I hope it makes sense and I tried to explain the answer. If not, please feel free to ask questions, because I get overwhelmed and try to throw so many information and I don't know if I'm making sense or not.
So Belen, there's a question for you in the chat box from Joy. Joy, do you just want to unmute yourself and ask the question, and then can answer?
Yeah, I actually have two. Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
We can.
I actually have two questions. One is there any factor affecting them choosing to become an app-based driver or a taxi driver? Like, do they newly migrated to city, or is there any other factors? And also you mentioned that you selected 20 taxi drivers, 8 Uber drivers, and 7 Cabify drivers. I just wanted to know why this proportion. Is there like a some consideration that I didn't get?
Okay. So about the why they choose to, well, thank you. Thanks for your question. Sorry, I was concentrated. Why they choose to become drivers. So I think for the taxi sector, I think both of them, what they have in common is a bit of a desperation and a lack of other opportunities. I think that's something they would have in common. So becoming a driver usually kind of becomes not a last resource, but kind of like one of the last resources. Malaga is a very sector-based economy because they receive a lot of tourism. So for most women, you either work in the service industry, but it's very seasonal. So it's also a bit unstable and hard to work at. So for the taxi drivers, usually it was they usually had some family links. So either someone else in the family was working as a taxi driver. So then they knew that it was actually a relatively easy job to do. And I think for the app-based, because it was something new, it was usually women who would not find any other job opportunity that would consider applying for this new app-based work, because actually it's quite easy to get into. You just need to drive. So yeah, I think it has for both cases. It has a bit of a last resource feeling. Yeah. And then I'm sorry, Jo, but I didn't understand your second question.
It's about the proportion of your subjects. You have 20 taxi drivers, 8 Uber drivers, and 7 Cabify drivers. I didn't know the difference between. I wanted to know why you chose this proportion, or it was just accidental or something.
It was mainly accidental. It was just because it was really difficult to find participants. So it was just a bit like what I could, the people I could meet. But it came about more or less similar proportions because taxi drivers are similar. So I consider them one group. And then the other one, Uber and Cabify, is just 2 different companies but work very similarly. So for me, it's like there are 2 groups actually. So the numbers came relatively close to, but yeah, it was so difficult to find participants. So it was just a matter of choice. I don't know if we have time because I also had a question reflection, but
we have 2 more minutes because we started 2 minutes late.
Okay. So just something, just something I was thinking.
30 seconds.
Okay, just very quickly. Something I was thinking about as Arunima was talking. So we've been talking a lot about sexual harassment, which also came up in my own research. But something also came up in my research, and I struggled with was flirtation. I know also it has a lot of cultural connotations, and it might be different. But my participants received a lot of flirting from customers, and they were fine with it. And I wasn't fine with it. So we had a bit of a struggle. And I had to, to reflect and reconsider that a lot. So I was just wondering if either of you had also like some kind of like this ambiguous behavior that you didn't really know, where to put it as. I don't know if my question makes sense.
30 seconds for you each. Joy, if you want to pick it up, flirtation in higher education. And go ahead.
Yeah, I will be very quick. It's not in higher education. I think in my group, most of the people who are talking about sexual harassment, they have already got some understanding of sexual harassment. They think from some kind of boxes. But I had happened to talk to some people who's working as like a nonprofit organization for migrant workers in Taiwan, and they were talking about these migrant workers from Southeast Asia who's suffering from some touching and comments and everything, but they don't really think these are sexual harassments. They were okay with it. And this was some kind of negotiation between them and their, like, because they need to live in with their employers. So that's some kind of like a negotiation between them and the employers in that kind of like a private or public working and also private kind of situation. That's just my reflection on this.
Arunima, any reflection? 30 seconds.
Yes, so yeah, so very quickly. So in terms of flirtation, I didn't really like, so my like the groups of women I interviewed, they had a very like strict separation. Some women had complete idea of what is sexual harassment. So for them, flirtation also includes a part of sexual harassment. And the other women, those who lack the vocabularies to explain sexual harassment, for them, again, sexual harassment altogether is a trivial issue, does not matter if it's flirtation or serious forms of sexual harassment, you know. So it's all like trivial issue. If you are traveling on overcrowded buses in Dhaka city, so you will be expecting some forms of touching or slurs or even like offensive comments. It's trivial issue, you know. So yes, I don't know if I answered it, but yes.
Maria, okay, you want to comment on this?
Well, I think we're out of official time, so thanks everyone for joining our second session. I liked how we were able to continue the discussion about class and the online spaces, because in our project, absolutely online ranting did not come up at all. Where we asked, where do you talk about this, which is probably a reflection about not having the money to have phones and internet bundles as among domestic workers and the factory workers. I hope we can continue the discussion after the conference. We all have each other's emails. Thanks, Hella, for chairing. Thanks, everyone, for joining this session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you to the
you.
speakers for presenting, and thank you to DSA for giving us the opportunity.
And I would very much like to thank you, Sohela. It has been a tremendous experience to share a session with you, because I have I have used your work a lot in my own thesis. So it has been a very good experience for me.
Thank you, Arunima. That's always nice to hear that work is useful, but I'm sure you all are doing fantastic work. And
please send us papers when you do, finalize them for submission, etc. Yeah.
So thank you all so much. I hope you have a lovely day and you have sessions to run to. So thank you for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
I think you can stop the recording now. Thank you so much, Eileen.